Ronald Vesperi was 21 years old, and he could end a man's life before breakfast without losing his appetite. That scorching afternoon in August, he was driving a black Porsche 911 Carrera down a crumbling two-lane highway cutting through the forgotten farmlands east of the city. He'd just survived an ambush at the docks, the kind of ambush that meant someone close to him had turned. His usual armored convoy would have made him a target you could spot from satellites, so he'd taken the Porsche from his private garage, chosen the back roads where his enemies wouldn't think to look, and brought no soldiers so he wouldn't leave a trail of bodies leading straight to him. This was how Ronald moved when the throne beneath him started to crack. But today, speed couldn't save him from something far more mundane. No, the temperature gauge spiked into the red. Then the engine began to knock like an angry heartbeat. Then the Porsche shuddered once and died right there on the sun-bleached asphalt, half a mile from nowhere. Ronald sat in the leather driver's seat for a moment, hand still gripping the wheel, a trickle of blood from the graze wound on his ribs, soaking through his white dress shirt beneath his tailored Italian suit jacket. He stepped out into the heat and stared at the hood as steam hissed out from the edges like the car was mocking him. No signal. He checked his phone twice. All around him stretched endless fields of wheat stubble and barbed wire fences. In the distance, a line of low hills shimmered in the heat haze. Not a house, not a person, not even a bird. Just the wind pushing dust devils across the road. He stood there, $8,000 suit, a blood-stained silk shirt, hands covered in tattoos that told stories he wished he could forget, and realized he had no idea what to do. Ronald Vesperi, the boy who'd clawed his way to the top of the city's underworld before he could legally buy a drink, now stood helpless beside a machine that wouldn't obey him. He was a genius at reading betrayal in men's eyes, a tactician who'd orchestrated hits across 3 states. But on this empty road, none of that mattered. The Porsche didn't care about his reputation. The engine didn't fear him. He almost laughed at himself. Good at ordering executions, useless at fixing an overheated engine. Then the girls appeared. 2 of them. Identical. They emerged from the tall grass on the roadside, like they'd been planted there, waiting just for him. Maybe 6 or 7 years old, wearing matching blue dresses that caught the wind, their dark hair pulled into identical ponytails. They walked in perfect sync, and when they stopped about 10 feet away from him, they both tilted their heads at exactly the same angle, studying him like scientists examining a curious specimen. For 5 long seconds, nobody moved. Ronald's hand instinctively shifted toward the gun tucked against his spine. These children couldn't be real. This had to be a setup, some elaborate trap. Kids didn't just appear in the middle of nowhere. Then both girls raised their right hands in unison and pointed directly at his Porsche. "You broke it," they said together, their voices overlapping like an echo. Ronald blinked. The girl on the left, or was it the right, wrinkled her nose. "Ah, it's smoking." "Our mum says you're not supposed to make cars smoke," added the other one. "That means you drove it wrong," the first concluded. Ronald opened his mouth, then closed it. In the last 72 hours, he'd been shot at, betrayed by his mentor, and forced to kill 2 men with his bare hands. And now he was being lectured by 2 children in blue dresses about automotive maintenance. You need to leave," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Go home." The girls didn't move. They glanced at each other, then back at him. "Do you need help?" they asked in unison. "No. You look like you need help." "I don't." "You're bleeding," one of them observed, pointing at his side where the blood had seeped through his jacket. Ronald looked down, then back up. It's none of your—" "Our mum can fix it," they interrupted together. He stared at them. "Fix what?" "Your car." They said it like he was the child, and they were the adults. She fixes everything. She's really good at it. I don't need... And she can probably fix that too. The girl on the left pointed at his ribs again. She used to be a nurse. Ronald felt the ground shift beneath him, not literally, but in some way he couldn't name. These two tiny humans weren't afraid of him. They weren't impressed by him. They were just trying to help, like he was a regular person broken down on a regular road. For the first time in years, Ronald Vesperi didn't know what his next move should be. "Come on," one twin said, already turning. "Our house isn't far," said the other, matching her sister's movement exactly. And then they started walking back the way they'd come, synchronized, certain, as if they'd already decided his fate for him. Ronald stood beside his dead Porsche, a Mafia Boss at 21 who'd never learned how to say no to children in blue dresses. After a moment, he followed them. The twins walked like they owned the world, chattering to each other in a language only they understood, occasionally glancing back to make sure Ronald was still following. He kept his distance, scanning the horizon every few seconds out of habit. The field stretched endlessly in every direction, golden and dry under the August sun. His ribs burned with each step, and sweat had started to soak through his collar. "How far is this house?" he called out. "Not far." They answered together without turning around. "Ah, you said that already." "Because it's still not far." Ronald bit back a response. Arguing with children was apparently not a skill he'd developed in his rise to power. They crested a low hill, and the farmhouse appeared below them like something out of a painting he'd never bothered to look at. White clapboard siding, faded red shutters, a wraparound porch sagging slightly on one side. Behind it stood a massive barn, and beside that, what looked like a large workshop, with its bay doors rolled open. The whole property had the worn-in look of a place that had been loved hard for a long time. "That's home," one twin announced proudly. "Mom's probably in the shop," said the other. They picked up their pace, blue dresses bouncing as they half-skipped down the dirt path. Ronald followed more slowly, on his eyes taking in the strategic layout of the property without meaning to. Clear sight lines, multiple exits, no cover between the road and the house, terrible defensive position. He caught himself and nearly laughed. He was evaluating a family farm like it was a battlefield. The girls led him past the house toward the workshop. As they got closer, Ronald heard the sharp hiss and crackle of a welding torch. Orange sparks fountained from inside the bay, and the smell of hot metal cut through the afternoon air. "Mom!" the twins shouted in perfect unison. "We brought someone." The welding torch clicked off. A figure straightened up from behind a massive tractor that had been stripped down to its skeleton. The person pulled off a welding helmet, and Ronald found himself looking at a woman probably in her early 30s, and wearing grease-stained coveralls and a tank top underneath that showed arms with the kind of practical muscle that came from real work. Not a gym. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her face had a smudge of grease across one cheekbone. She looked at her daughters, then at Ronald, and her expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession. Confusion, assessment, recognition of danger. Then something that looked almost like resignation. "Girls," she said calmly, setting the torch down carefully. "Go inside and wash up for dinner." "But Mom, now please." The twins deflated slightly but obeyed, trudging toward the house with exaggerated sighs. Ronald watched them go, then turned back to find the woman studying him with eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She'd clocked the blood on his shirt, the bulge of the gun at his spine, the tattoos creeping up from his collar. Her gaze lingered on his hands, on the scars across his knuckles that told stories he'd never share. "You're bleeding," she said flatly. "It's handled." Doesn't look handled." She wiped her hands on a rag that was probably dirtier than her hands. "My daughters said you broke down on Route 40. The car overheated." "What are you driving?" "Porsche 911. She let out a short laugh that held no humor. "You took a Porsche through this heat on those roads? Those engines aren't built for sustained high speeds in this kind of environment. The cooling system probably couldn't keep up." She paused. "Also, you're running from something." It wasn't a question. Ronald's jaw tightened. "I can pay you. Whatever you want. Just fix the car and I'll be gone before sunset." The woman crossed her arms and leaned back against the tractor, regarding him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I'm Anita. This is my property, my shop, and those are my girls. So let's establish something right now. I don't care what you're running from or what you've done. But you brought whatever trouble you're carrying to my doorstep, so you're going to follow my rules." Ronald started to respond, but she held up a hand. "I'll tow your car and fix it. It'll take me at least until tomorrow morning, maybe longer depending on what's actually wrong. In exchange, I've got about 2 cords of wood that need splitting for winter, and my fence line has posts that need replacing." She gestured toward a pile of lumber near the barn. "Ah, you look strong enough to handle manual labor. You want me to chop wood?" "That's what I said." Ronald stared at her. He was a syndicate boss. He had men who would kill for him without question. He controlled territory worth millions. And this woman in coveralls was telling him to chop wood like he was some farmhand looking for work. Anita met his stare without flinching. She'd seen the gun, the tattoos, the blood, the expensive suit ruined by dirt and sweat. She knew exactly what kind of man stood in her workshop, and she wasn't backing down. Finally, Ronald nodded once. "Fine. Good." Anita pushed off the tractor and grabbed her welding gloves. "There's a first aid kit in the bathroom off the kitchen. Clean yourself up, then come back out. Wood piles behind the barn, axe is in the shed. And try not to bleed on my porch." She turned back to her work, dismissing him like he was nothing more than a minor inconvenience in her day. Ronald walked towards the house, feeling more off balance than he had since he was 16 years old and fighting for his first territory. Somewhere in the distance, one of the twins laughed, and the sound carried across the farmyard like bells. He'd faced down rivals with guns. He'd stared down dirty cops and politicians. But this woman with grease on her face and a welding torch in her hand had just negotiated with him like an equal. And somehow, impossibly, he'd agreed. The bathroom was small and smelled like lavender soap. Ronald stood shirtless in front of the mirror, examining the graze wound across his ribs. The bullet had carved a shallow channel through skin and muscle. Angry and red, but not deep enough to need stitches. He'd been lucky. 3 inches to the left, and he'd have bled out in the Porsche before the twins ever found him. He cleaned the wound with antiseptic from Anita's first aid kit, jaw clenched against the sting, then wrapped it with gauze and medical tape. His hands moved with practiced efficiency. This wasn't the first time he'd patched himself up, and it probably wouldn't be the last. Assuming he survived the week. He pulled his ruined shirt back on, grimacing at the bloodstains, then stepped out onto the back porch. The sun had started its descent toward the horizon, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Ronald pulled out his phone and held it up, watching the signal indicator refuse to budge from 0 bars. He walked to the edge of the porch. Still nothing. He moved toward the barn, then the fence line, holding the phone up like some kind of divining rod searching for civilization. Nothing. 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 His Lieutenant Anthony needed to know he was alive. His accountant needed instructions about moving the offshore funds. His network needed to know the uncle's betrayal so they could choose sides before the war escalated. But out here, surrounded by wheat fields and silence, Ronald Vesperi might as well have vanished from the earth. He was about to try walking up the access road when he heard whispers behind him. Ronald turned slowly. The twins were crouched behind a water trough about 15 feet away, their heads barely visible over the rim. They weren't very good at hiding. Their blue dresses stuck out like flags against the dusty grey metal. "I can see you," he said, both heads ducked down. "I can still see you." Giggling erupted from behind the trough. Then one of them stage whispered to the other, "He's got really good eyes." "Mum says bad guys always have good eyes." Ronald's eyebrow went up. "Did she call me a bad guy?" "She didn't say you were good," one twin replied, popping up briefly before ducking back down. He should walk away. He had wood to chop, a car that needed fixing, and enemies who were probably burning through resources trying to find him. He didn't have time for whatever game these children were playing, but his feet didn't move. "What are you doing?" he asked instead. "Hunting," they answered together. "Hunting what?" "You." Before Ronald could process that response, and both girls exploded from behind the trough with battle cries that would have done his street soldiers proud. They charged across the yard in perfect synchronization, blue dresses streaming behind them like battle flags. Ronald's combat instincts kicked in automatically. He shifted his weight, calculated angles, prepared to sidestep. Then his brain caught up with his body and reminded him these were 7-year-old girls, not assassins, and he froze in pure confusion. They hit him like tiny missiles, one grabbing his left leg, the other his right, their combined weight and momentum actually making him stumble backward. "We got him!" one shrieked triumphantly. "Prisoner captured!" The other confirmed. Ronald looked down at the two children wrapped around his legs like anchors. In the last 5 years, he'd survived 3 assassination attempts, a gang war that left 17 men dead, and a police investigation that nearly sent him to prison for life. He'd stared down men twice his size without blinking, and now he'd been taken down by elementary school students in matching outfits. "Let go," he said, trying to sound authoritative. "Nope," they replied in unison. "I have work to do." "You're our prisoner now. Prisoners don't get to do work." "That's not how prisoners work." One of them looked up at him with enormous brown eyes. "Have you ever been a prisoner before?" Ronald thought about the 3 days he'd spent in a rival gang's basement when he was 17, zip-tied to a chair, waiting to see if they'd kill him or recruit him. "Yes, actually." "Then you should know the rules," she said matter-of-factly. "Rule 1 is you have to do what we say." "That's definitely not Rule 1. "Rule 2, the other twin continued, ignoring him completely, "is you have to give us piggyback rides." "Absolutely not." They tightened their grip on his legs. "Prisoner doesn't get to say no." Ronald tried to take a step and nearly fell over. The girls clung to him like barnacles, giggling hysterically as he attempted to shake them off without actually hurting them. He'd calculated tactical approaches to fortified warehouses with less difficulty than he was having with basic locomotion. If seeing a tough guy melt for these twins put a smile on your face, please hit the like button. It helps us share more moments of unexpected kindness with the world. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "Piggyback rides." They chanted together. "Piggyback rides." "I'm injured. Mom fixed you. I have wood to chop. Wood can wait. We can't wait. We've been waiting our whole lives for a prisoner." Ronald closed his eyes and tried to remember how he'd gotten here. This morning he'd been a crime boss running a multi-million-dollar operation. Now he was being held hostage by children who probably still believed in the Tooth Fairy. He looked toward the house, hoping Anita would intervene. Through the kitchen window, he could see her moving around inside, and unless he was mistaken, she was watching this entire scene play out with what looked suspiciously like amusement. She wasn't going to help him. The twins had started singing some kind of victory song, still attached to his legs. Ronald Vesperi, who'd ordered hits without hesitation. Who'd built an empire before he was old enough to rent a car, who'd never backed down from a fight in his life. looked down at two 7-year-old girls in blue dresses and realized he had absolutely no idea what to do. "Fine," he heard himself say. "One ride, then you let me go." The screaming and cheering that followed probably scared birds out of trees 3 farms over. Ronald bent down carefully, favoring his injured ribs, and let them climb onto his back. They weighed almost nothing. Their hands locked around his neck, not choking but holding on with complete trust that he wouldn't drop them. When was the last time anyone had trusted him with something precious? He straightened up, and they shrieked with delight. "Faster!" one commanded. "To the barn!" ordered the other. Ronald started walking, and these 2 tiny dictators on his back, and wondered what his lieutenant would say if he could see the fearsome Don Vesperi now. Probably nothing. Anthony would be too busy laughing to breathe. From the kitchen window, Anita watched, shook her head, and smiled. The dining table was old pine, scarred with years of use, and set for 4. Ronald sat in the chair Anita had pointed to, which happened to be the only seat that gave him a clear view of both the front door and the kitchen entrance. He didn't choose it consciously. His body just moved there automatically, the same way his hand kept drifting toward where his gun would be if he hadn't left it locked in the Porsche's glove box at Anita's polite but firm request. The twins sat across from him, swinging their legs under the table, and still buzzing with energy from their earlier prisoner capture victory. They'd argued for 10 minutes about which one of them had actually caught him first, before Anita had settled it by declaring they'd both won equally. Anita brought a large pot to the table and ladled out what looked like chicken stew with vegetables. The smell hit Ronald like a memory he didn't know he had. Home cooking. Real food made by someone who cared whether it tasted good. Not restaurant meals eaten alone in expensive dining rooms or takeout consumed over paperwork at 3 in the morning. "Sandra, Samantha, what do we say?" Anita prompted. "Thank you for dinner, Mama," they chorused. Anita glanced at Ronald, and he realized she was waiting for something. "Thank you," he added, the words feeling rusty in his mouth. She nodded and sat down across from him, taking the seat that put her back to the kitchen. Trusting. Or maybe just testing him. The twins dove into their food with enthusiasm, keeping up a running conversation that consisted mostly of talking over each other about everything and nothing. Ronald ate slowly, methodically, keeping his movements controlled despite the hunger gnawing at his stomach. He couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten. Yesterday? The day before? "You sit like my old attending physician," Anita said suddenly. Ronald looked up, spoon halfway to his mouth. "Dr. Reeves, trauma surgeon at County General in Chicago." Anita broke a piece of bread and handed half to each twin. Always sat with his back to the wall in the staff cafeteria. Said it was a habit from working in the ER for 20 years. You see enough violence, you stop trusting open spaces behind you. Ronald set his spoon down carefully. "You were a nurse." 11 years, ER mostly, some ICU. She said it casually, but her eyes never left his face. "You get good at reading people in that job. Who's telling the truth about how they got hurt? Who's going to pull through and who's given up? Who's running from something?" One of the twins, Sandra maybe, piped up. "Mama used to fix people in the big hospital before we were born. She fixed a man who got stabbed 7 times, Samantha added with disturbing enthusiasm. He lived. "Girls, we don't talk about stabbings at dinner," Anita said mildly, though a small smile tugged at her mouth. Ronald picked up his spoon again, trying to look unbothered. The stew was good. Better than good. It tasted like something people made when they cared about the people eating it. "Those bruises on your ribs," Anita continued, as if discussing the weather. The ones you cleaned up in my bathroom. You do a decent job with field dressing, I'll give you that. I'm fine. That wasn't a question. She took a sip of water. But since we're pretending to have a conversation about it, why don't you tell me how you got those bruises? Ronald met her eyes across the table. The twins had gone quiet, sensing the shift in tone, even if they didn't understand it. Construction accident? He said evenly. Rebar fell at a job site. Anita's expression didn't change. She buttered a piece of bread with deliberate care, then looked back at him. That's interesting, because that's not a bruise and we both know it. That's a bullet graze, maybe 9 mm from the track pattern, less than 48 hours old based on the inflammation. The trajectory suggests the shooter was either firing from a moving vehicle or you were moving when they fired. Probably both. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Ronald's hand tightened on his spoon. Across the table, the twins had stopped eating, their eyes wide and locked on their mother. You're guessing, Ronald said quietly. I spent a decade in Chicago ER. I've cleaned and stitched more gunshot wounds than I can count. Gang violence, domestic disputes, robberies gone wrong, cops who took fire in the line of duty. Anita's voice remained calm, almost conversational. I know the difference between someone who fell on rebar and someone who got shot. And I definitely know the difference between construction workers and men who live by violence. She gestured at his hands, still holding the spoon. Your knuckles have scar tissue from repeated impact trauma. Your right hand has what looks like a defensive wound across the palm that's maybe 6 months old. You've got at least 3 tattoos I can see from here, and based on the style and placement, I'd guess they mean something specific to people in your world. Ronald set down his spoon. You should be careful making accusations. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm stating facts. Anita leaned back in her chair. The question is whether you're going to keep lying to me in front of my daughters, or whether you're going to give me enough truth that I can make an informed decision about whether you're a danger to my family. The twins looked between their mother and Ronald like they were watching a tennis match. I'm not a danger to you, Ronald said finally. People who aren't dangerous don't usually end up shot and stranded on back roads in the middle of nowhere. It's complicated. It always is. Anita stood and started collecting empty bowls. Here's what's not complicated. You're hurt, you're running from something, and my daughters led you to my doorstep. So now you're my problem, whether I like it or not. I'm choosing to help you because that's what we do out here. But don't mistake kindness for stupidity, and don't lie to me again. She carried the dishes to the kitchen, leaving Ronald sitting at the too small table with 2 7-year-olds staring at him with identical expressions of fascination. Are you a secret agent? Sandra whispered. Or a spy? Samantha added hopefully. Ronald looked at these 2 little girls who saw adventure where there was only violence, who saw mystery where there was only survival. No, he said quietly. I'm just someone who made a lot of bad choices. From the kitchen, Anita called out, There's pie for dessert, apple. And Ronald, after dinner, you've still got wood to chop. The twins cheered about pie. Ronald sat in his chair, back to the wall, and wondered when he'd lost control of absolutely everything in his life. The sun had nearly set by the time Ronald finished splitting wood. His shirt was soaked through with sweat, and his hands blistered despite the work gloves Anita had tossed him, and his ribs screamed with every swing of the axe. But the woodpile behind the barn had grown considerably, and there was something almost meditative about the repetitive motion. Lift, swing, split. Lift, swing, split. No strategy required, no one to outthink or outmaneuver, just wood and physics. He'd stacked the last of the split logs when he heard the twins shrieking from somewhere near the house. Not frightened shrieks. Joy shrieks, the kind that came from playing so hard you forgot to breathe. Ronald walked around to the front of the house and found them in the yard, chasing fireflies in the gathering dusk. They ran in chaotic zigzag patterns, blue dresses now grass-stained and dirty, their hands cupped, trying to catch the blinking lights that danced just out of reach. When one of them actually caught a firefly, she'd call her sister over, and they'd both peer into her hands with reverent wonder before releasing it and starting the chase all over again. Ronald stood at the edge of the porch, watching them. They moved with such uncomplicated happiness, such pure absorption in the moment. There was no calculation in their movements, no consideration of consequences or strategic positioning. They were just playing, just being children. He tried to remember the last time he'd played anything that wasn't a calculated move in someone else's game. He couldn't. The memory hit him without warning. He was 14, standing in an alley behind a Korean grocery store on the south side, and 3 older boys from a rival crew had cornered him, demanding he hand over the collection money he'd just picked up. He could still feel the weight of the pipe in his hand, the one he'd grabbed from a dumpster. Could still hear the crack when he'd swung it into the first boy's knee. The fight had lasted maybe 90 seconds. He'd walked away with a broken nose and 2 cracked ribs. The other 3 hadn't walked away at all. 15, in a basement apartment that smelled like cigarettes and mold, listening to men twice his age argue about territory and percentages while he sat in the corner taking notes. He'd been the youngest person in the room by a decade, but he'd been the one doing the math, finding the angles they couldn't see. By the end of that meeting, they'd been listening to him instead of arguing with each other. 16, I in the back of a stolen car, driving to his first real job. Not collecting protection money or running packages. The real thing, the kind of work you didn't come back from unchanged. He'd thrown up afterward, behind a warehouse, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold his weapon. Then he'd wiped his mouth, straightened his jacket, and gone back to report that it was done. 17, 18, 19, 20. Each year measured not in birthdays or milestones, but in territory gained, enemies eliminated, respect earned through fear and blood and ruthless efficiency. 21, and he couldn't remember what it felt like to chase fireflies. You look about 100 years old right now. Anita's voice came from behind him. Ronald turned to find her standing in the doorway, 2 bottles of beer in her hands. She walked over and handed him one, then leaned against the porch railing beside him. Thanks, he said quietly. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the twins continue their hunt. One of them had started singing some made-up song about catching stars. The other joined in immediately, harmonizing in that unconscious way siblings did. How old are you, really? Anita asked. 21. She took a long pull from her beer. You carry yourself like someone who's been through a war. Something like that. Let me guess. Started young, had to grow up fast. Survival mode became the only mode you knew. She wasn't looking at him, just watching her daughters play. And now you can't remember what it was like to be a kid because you never really got to be one. Ronald's grip tightened on the beer bottle. You a therapist too, I along with nurse and mechanic? No, just someone who's seen a lot of broken people. She glanced at him. You wear it different than most, but it's the same look. Like you're always waiting for the next hit. Like relaxing might get you killed. One of the twins called out, Mama, look! And held up her cupped hands. Both women, Anita and Ronald, watched as she carefully opened her fingers to reveal a firefly crawling across her palm, its abdomen pulsing with soft green light. Beautiful, baby, Anita called back. Now let it go so it can find its family. The twin released it, and both girls watched it fly away before immediately sprinting off to find more. I was 14 the first time I had to fight for real, Ronald said suddenly. The words came out before he could stop them. Not playground stuff. Real fighting. The kind where if you lose, you don't get up. Anita didn't respond, just took another sip of her beer and waited. 15, I was running numbers and sitting in on strategy meetings. 16, I did my first real job. He paused. By the time I was 18, I'd built a reputation. By 20, I was running things, and now I'm 21, and I can't remember the last time I slept through the night or trusted anyone or did anything just because I wanted to instead of because it was tactically sound. That's a lot of weight for someone who can't legally buy the beer he's drinking. Anita observed. Ronald almost laughed. Yeah. You ever think about walking away? Starting over somewhere? Every day. But the thing about my line of work is you don't get to retire. You either die in the game, or you die trying to leave it. Anita was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, My ex-husband used to say something similar. He was a cop, undercover narcotics. Said he couldn't leave because he was in too deep, knew too much, had too many enemies. Said walking away would just get him killed faster. What happened to him? He left anyway, moved to Oregon, changed his name, started selling insurance. She smiled slightly. Last I heard, he's alive and boring and takes his new wife to farmers' markets on Sundays. It's different when you're running the organization instead of infiltrating it. Maybe. Or maybe you're just more afraid of being ordinary than you are of being dead. The words hit harder than they should have. Ronald watched the twins collapse in the grass, Aunt giggling and breathless from running. They lay on their backs, looking up at the stars that were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. I don't even know what ordinary looks like anymore, he admitted. Anita gestured at her daughters with her beer bottle. Looks like that. Looks like laughing until your stomach hurts and chasing things you can't catch and falling asleep knowing tomorrow's probably going to be pretty much like today. Sounds boring. Sounds like peace. Ronald took a long drink from his beer and let himself imagine it. Just for a second. A life where the biggest decision was what to make for dinner. Where he could sit on a porch without cataloguing exit routes. Where he could close his eyes without seeing the faces of everyone he'd hurt. It seemed impossible, like a fantasy someone else got to live. The twins had started making snow angels in the grass, their movements synchronized even now. They're lucky to have you, Ronald said quietly. They're lucky to have this, Anita corrected. The space to just be kids, that's all any child really needs. Time and space, and someone who keeps them safe while they figure out who they are. Ronald thought about the 14-year-old version of himself, standing in that alley with a pipe in his hands and murder in his future. Nobody had kept him safe. Nobody had given him time. Your car should be ready by tomorrow afternoon, Anita said, pushing off the railing. Then you can get back to your war. We believe everyone deserves a second chance at peace. If you're rooting for Ronald to find a better life, consider subscribing. Your support allows us to keep telling stories about redemption and hope. She walked inside, leaving Ronald alone on the porch with an empty beer bottle and the sound of children laughing under stars he'd forgotten how to see. Ronald hadn't meant to fall asleep. After Anita had gone inside, he'd stayed on the porch for another hour, nursing a second beer and watching the darkness settle over the farmland like a blanket. The twins had eventually been called in for baths, their protests echoing through the open windows before finally fading to silence. The house had grown quiet except for the occasional creak of old wood settling and the distant sound of crickets. When the mosquitoes had started biting, he'd moved inside to the living room. The couch was old and lumpy, covered in a faded floral pattern that had probably been cheerful once, and he'd sat down just to rest for a minute, his body finally acknowledging the toll of the day. The graze wound throbbed with a dull ache. His hands hurt from splitting wood. His shoulders were tight from the constant vigilance he'd maintained since the ambush at the docks. Just for a moment, he'd let his eyes close. The thing about living in a state of perpetual threat is that real sleep becomes almost impossible. For years, Ronald had trained himself to stay in the shallow waters of consciousness, never diving deep enough to be vulnerable. Cat naps in his office chair, an hour here or there in safe houses with armed guards outside. He'd learned to function on fractured rest, his nervous system hardwired to jolt awake at the slightest irregularity. But something about this house, this quiet farm in the middle of nowhere, had managed to bypass his defenses. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the sense that, for the first time in years, he was somewhere his enemies couldn't immediately find him. Maybe it was the unfamiliar feeling of being around people who weren't afraid of him or trying to use him. Whatever the reason, Ronald Vesperi slept, really slept. Deep, dreamless, the kind of sleep his body had been craving for longer than he could remember. The sound that woke him was tiny. A twig snapping outside, a soft crack that barely registered above the ambient noise of the night. Ronald's eyes snapped open. His hand moved before his brain fully engaged, muscle memory taking over. In one fluid motion, he rolled off the couch into a crouch, his right hand closing around the folding knife he'd kept tucked in his boot, despite Anita's weapon policy. The blade clicked open with a quiet snick that sounded deafening in the silent house. His heart hammered against his ribs. Adrenaline flooded his system, sharpening everything to crystal clarity. He scanned the room in the darkness, cataloging shadows and potential threats. The front door was 15 feet away, the kitchen entrance behind him, windows on 2 walls, curtains drawn but not heavy enough to stop bullets. Another sound. Movement on the porch. Footsteps. No, not footsteps. Too light. Too irregular. Ronald moved toward the window in a low crouch, keeping below the sight line, knife held in a reverse grip ready to strike. His breathing had gone shallow and controlled. Every sense was dialed to maximum. This was the mode he lived in, the one where hesitation meant death and paranoia meant survival. And he reached the window and risked a glance through a gap in the curtains. A deer stood on the front porch, its head lowered as it investigated a flower pot near the door, probably drawn by the smell of the herbs Anita was growing. Just an animal. Not an assassin. Not a hit squad. Not the uncle's enforcers come to finish what they'd started. Just a deer. Ronald exhaled slowly, his grip on the knife loosening slightly. The adrenaline was still coursing through him, making his hands shake. He leaned his forehead against the cool wall and tried to slow his racing heart. Is it a bad guy? The small voice from the stairs nearly stopped his heart completely. Ronald spun, the knife coming back up instinctively before his conscious mind could override the reflex. Sandra and Samantha stood halfway down the staircase in matching pajamas covered in stars and moons. They must have heard him moving around. They stared at him with wide eyes, frozen in place. Not staring at him, staring at the knife in his hand. Time seemed to suspend itself. Ronald saw the fear flicker across their faces, saw the way Sandra's hand reached for her sister's, saw how they both took an involuntary step backward up the stairs. They were afraid of him. These 2 little girls who'd tackled him in the yard, who'd demanded piggyback rides, who'd caught fireflies and sung made-up songs. They were looking at him the way everyone else did. Like he was dangerous. Like he was something to fear, because he was. Ronald lowered the knife slowly, carefully folding it closed with hands that were still trembling. It's okay, he said quietly. It's just a deer, on the porch. It startled me. Neither twin moved. They stood pressed together on the stairs, and Ronald could see Samantha's bottom lip starting to quiver. I'm sorry, he said, and the words felt inadequate. I didn't mean to scare you, I woke up and heard a noise and I thought... He trailed off. What could he possibly say that would make this better? That he thought someone was coming to kill him? that his first instinct when startled was to prepare for violence. "Ronald has a knife," Sandra whispered to her sister. "Mama said no weapons in the house," Samantha whispered back. Footsteps sounded from the upstairs hallway. Anita appeared at the top of the stairs in a robe, her hair loose around her shoulders. She took in the scene immediately. Ronald standing in the living room with a knife in his hand, her daughters huddled together on the stairs, the tension thick enough to cut. Her expression hardened. "Girls, go back to your room." "But Mama, now!" The twins scrambled back up the stairs, giving Ronald a wide berth as they passed their mother. He heard their bedroom door close, heard the muffled sound of voices. Anita descended the stairs slowly, stopping a safe distance away. Her eyes went to the knife, then to his face. "There was a deer," Ronald said. "I heard something and I reacted. I didn't know they were there." "You pulled a weapon in a house with children." "I know. After I specifically asked you not to bring weapons inside." "I know." He set the knife on the coffee table, stepping away from it. "I'm sorry. I was asleep. I heard a noise. It was instinct." "Instinct," Anita repeated flatly. "Your instinct is to come up armed and ready to kill." "Yes." The single word hung in the air between them. There was no point denying it. She'd seen exactly who he was the moment she'd looked at him in her workshop. This just confirmed what she already knew. "They were coming downstairs to get water," Anita said. "They're 7 years old. They wanted water, and instead they found a man with a knife looking like he was ready to fight for his life against a deer." Ronald closed his eyes. "I know. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for them to see that." "But that's who you are, isn't it? That's what you bring with you everywhere you go." Anita's voice wasn't angry. It was something worse. Disappointed. "You can't turn it off. Even here. Even when you're safe." "I'm never safe. My daughters are supposed to be." The words hit like a physical blow. Ronald opened his eyes and saw Anita watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not fear, not anger, something closer to sadness. "Your car will be ready by noon tomorrow," she said quietly. "I think it's best if you leave as soon as it's fixed." She turned and walked back upstairs without waiting for a response. Ronald stood alone in the dark living room, the knife on the table catching the moonlight through the window. Outside, the deer had wandered off into the night. Inside, he could hear muffled voices from upstairs. Anita's low and soothing, the twins asking questions he couldn't make out. He'd been here less than 12 hours, and he'd already brought his poison into their sanctuary. And he picked up the knife and slipped it back into his boot, then returned to the couch. But he didn't lie down. He sat with his back against the armrest, facing the door, and waited for morning to come. Sleep was impossible now. It had been foolish to think otherwise. Morning came grey and heavy with clouds that promised rain. Ronald had watched the sun fail to rise, just a gradual lightening of the darkness into something dim and colourless. He'd stayed on the couch all night, rigid and awake, listening to the house settle around him and hating himself a little more with each passing hour. Around 6, he heard Anita moving in the kitchen. The coffee maker gurgled to life. She didn't come into the living room, didn't acknowledge his presence. After a while, he heard her boots on the porch, then the sound of the workshop door rolling open. The twins came downstairs around 7, quieter than usual. They glanced at him from the kitchen doorway, whispering to each other, before retreating back upstairs with bowls of cereal. He'd become the monster under the stairs, the dangerous thing their mother had warned them about. Ronald stood, his body stiff from a night spent motionless, and walked outside. The workshop was alive with activity. Anita had the Porsche up on the lift, its underbelly exposed like a patient on an operating table. She was underneath it, tools spread around her on a rolling cart, working with the focused intensity of a surgeon. She'd pulled her hair back and wore safety glasses that kept sliding down her nose. Ronald stood in the doorway, uncertain. He'd faced down armed rivals with more confidence than he felt walking into this workshop. Coolant system was completely shot, Anita said without looking at him. The radiator had a crack you probably couldn't see, and the water pump was failing. You were basically driving a bomb waiting to overheat. She slid out from under the car and sat up, pushing the safety glasses onto her forehead. I've replaced both. Also did your oil while I was at it, because apparently you've been running on prayers and fumes for the last 1,000 miles. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You owe me $800 for parts and labor. Ronald nodded. He'd have paid 10 times that. I can get you cash when I'm back in the city. I don't take I owe us from people I don't trust. She stood and wiped her hands on a rag. But we'll figure it out. They stood in awkward silence, the Porsche suspended between them like a prisoner awaiting judgment. About last night. Ronald started. You pulled a knife on a deer and traumatized my children. I know. In my house, after I explicitly told you no weapons. I know. Anita tossed the rag onto her workbench and leaned back against it, crossing her arms. You want to know what I saw when I opened up your car's engine? The change in subject threw him. What? A machine that was designed for one thing and pushed to do something it wasn't built for. This car is made for controlled bursts of speed on proper roads with proper cooling. Track racing, show driving, not sustained high-speed chases through desert backroads in August heat. She gestured at the Porsche above them. You redlined it for hours, didn't you? Pushed it past its limits because you had no choice, and it lasted as long as it could before it just gave out. Ronald said nothing. That's not a design flaw, Anita continued. That's what happens when you take something beautiful and functional and force it to operate in survival mode until it breaks. She looked at him directly. Sound familiar? It's a car. It's a metaphor. She pulled off her safety glasses and set them down. You were what, 14 when you started? Fighting and running and surviving, and now you're 21 and you can't even sleep without a weapon in reach. You've been redlining for 7 years straight, and you're wondering why you're breaking down. Ronald's jaw tightened. I didn't come here for therapy. No, you came here because your getaway car died, and my daughters found you. But now you're here, and I'm telling you the same thing I'm telling your Porsche. You need to stop. Actually stop, before you seize up completely. I can't just stop. It doesn't work like that. It does if you choose to make it work like that. Anita walked over to her workbench and picked up a paper bag, handing it to him. Inside were his car keys. Your car's ready. You can leave right now if you want. Drive back to your war, your territory, your enemies. Keep running hot until something vital breaks and you don't get up again. Ronald took the keys, feeling their weight in his palm. Or, Anita said quietly, you can stay one more day. He looked up sharply. You just said I should leave. I said your car was ready. I didn't say I wanted you gone. She glanced toward the house. Tomorrow is the twins' 7th birthday. We're having a small party, just us and a couple neighbor kids. Cake, games, the whole normal childhood experience you never got to have. After last night, you want me at your daughter's birthday party? I want to give you a choice. Anita's expression softened slightly. Last night you scared them because you're operating on survival instinct 24/7. But before that, they loved you. They tackled you and made you give them piggyback rides, and you let them. You chopped wood for 3 hours without complaining. You sat at my table and ate my food, and for maybe 5 minutes, you looked almost peaceful. Until I pulled a knife. Until your trauma pulled a knife. She corrected. There's a difference. You're not a bad person, Ronald. You're a hurt person who's done bad things to survive. Those aren't the same thing. The clouds outside had grown darker. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Why are you doing this? Ronald asked. Why give me another chance? Anita was quiet for a moment, looking at the Porsche suspended above them. Because everyone deserves at least one person who sees past the survival mechanisms to the person underneath. And because my girls asked me this morning if you were coming to their birthday party. She smiled sadly. Sandra wanted to know if you'd play tag. Samantha wanted to know if you knew how to blow up balloons. They asked for me, after last night. Kids are resilient. They're also better at forgiving than adults. She pushed off the workbench. So here's the deal. You can leave now, get back to your life, and we'll forget this ever happened. Or you can stay for 24 more hours, help set up for a birthday party, eat cake, pretend to be normal for one day, then leave tomorrow night. Ronald looked at the keys in his hand, then at the Porsche. Fixed, ready to go, his escape route restored. He thought about Anthony and the organization and the uncle's betrayal. He thought about the war waiting for him back in the city, the violence and strategy and constant vigilance. He thought about being 21 years old and feeling 50. Then he thought about two little girls in blue dresses asking if he knew how to blow up balloons. What time's the party? He heard himself ask. Anita's smile was small but genuine. 2 o'clock. We've got a lot of setup to do before then. I don't know how to plan a birthday party. Good thing I do. She walked past him toward the house. Come on. Those balloons aren't going to inflate themselves, and I need someone tall to hang the streamers. Ronald pocketed the keys and followed her out of the workshop. Behind them, the Porsche sat silent and ready on the lift, its engine fixed, but its journey temporarily postponed. The first drops of rain began to fall as they reached the porch, and for the first time in 7 years, Ronald Vesperi chose to stay somewhere instead of run. It felt terrifying. It felt like hope. The party had been going for almost an hour when Ronald saw the dust cloud on the horizon. He was standing near the barn, watching Sandra and Samantha play pin the tail on the donkey with 3 neighbor kids whose names he'd already forgotten. The twins wore matching pink dresses today instead of blue, and their hair done up in elaborate braids that Anita must have spent an hour on. They looked happy, safe, like children should look. Ronald had spent the morning helping set up, hanging streamers from the porch rafters, arranging folding tables in the yard, blowing up what felt like 1,000 balloons until he got lightheaded. The twins had supervised his every move with exacting standards, repositioning decorations he'd hung and critiquing his balloon tying technique. He'd let them boss him around without complaint, and somewhere in the middle of it all, he'd caught himself almost smiling. Almost. Anita had made a cake that looked like a unicorn, complete with a twisted horn made of fondant and a mane of rainbow frosting. The twins had screamed when they saw it, jumping up and down in synchronized excitement that made the porch shake. They'd hugged their mother. Then, after a moment's hesitation, they'd hugged Ronald too. He'd frozen at first, unsure what to do with his hands, before awkwardly patting their backs. When he'd looked up, Anita was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Now he stood in the warm afternoon sun, a paper plate with cake crumbs in his hand, watching children play games he'd never played. One of the neighbor kids had brought a dog, some kind of mutt that kept trying to steal food from the tables. Everything was noise and laughter and chaos. Normal chaos, happy chaos. Then he saw the dust. At first it was just a smudge on the horizon where the access road met the highway. Could have been anything. A farmer heading home, a delivery truck taking a wrong turn. But Ronald's instincts, honed by 7 years of survival, they started screaming before his conscious mind caught up. The dust cloud was moving too fast, and there was too much of it. Multiple vehicles. He set down his plate carefully and walked toward the front of the property, trying to look casual. His hand drifted towards his waistband where his gun wasn't, because he'd left it locked in the Porsche's glove box like Anita had asked. The knife was still in his boot, though. Always the knife. The dust cloud resolved into shapes. Black SUVs. 3 of them, moving in formation down the dirt road, like wolves closing in on prey. Ronald's blood went cold. They'd found him. We're about to enter the climax. If you're on the edge of your seat, leave a comment below. Do you think Ronald can save them without losing himself again? Engaging with the video helps these stories reach more people who love a good thriller. He didn't know how. Satellite surveillance, maybe, or they'd tracked his phone before the signal died, or someone had seen the Porsche and reported it. The how didn't matter. What mattered was that 3 SUVs full of the uncle's men were less than 2 minutes away from a farmhouse full of children. Ronald turned and walked quickly back toward the party, keeping his movements controlled. Anita saw his face and immediately set down the pitcher of lemonade she'd been refilling. "What's wrong?" she asked quietly. "Black SUVs, 3 of them, coming down the access road." His voice was calm, but his eyes were already scanning the property, calculating angles and cover and how many seconds they had. "You need to get everyone inside. Now." Anita's face went pale, but she didn't freeze. ER nurse training kicked in. She turned to the neighbor parents. "Everyone inside, please. Storm's coming in faster than expected." "But the sky's clear." One of the mothers protested. "Inside, now." Anita's tone left no room for argument. The adults started herding children toward the house, confused but compliant. The twins ran over to Ronald, still holding pieces of birthday cake. "What's happening?" Sandra asked. "Why do we have to go inside?" Samantha added. Ronald crouched down to their eye level, his hands on their shoulders. "Remember yesterday when you captured me and I was your prisoner?" They nodded, uncertain. "Well, now we're going to play a different game. It's called hide and seek. But the most important rule is that you have to stay absolutely quiet no matter what you hear. Can you do that?" "But it's our birthday," Sandra said, her voice wavering. "I know, sweetheart, I know." The endearment came out before he could stop it. "But I need you to be brave right now, both of you. Can you be brave for me?" They looked at each other, then back at him, and nodded. Anita had gotten the other families into the house. She came running back out, her face tight with controlled fear. "What do we do?" "You have a storm cellar. Behind the house. Root cellar, really, but it's underground. Get everyone down there. Lock it from the inside. Don't come out until I come get you." "What are you going to do?" Ronald stood, his hand already moving to pull the knife from his boot. What I'm good at." "Ronald, there's no time." He gripped her arm, making sure she was looking at him. "These men are here for me. If they find you, if they find the kids, they'll use you as leverage. Your only safety is being invisible. Get underground and stay there." The SUVs were close enough now that he could hear the engines. Anita grabbed the twins' hands. "Come on, girls, quickly." "But what about Ronald?" Samantha asked. "Ronald will be fine," Anita said, pulling them toward the back of the house, even as her eyes told Ronald she wasn't sure she believed it. The other families were already streaming out the back door toward the cellar. Ronald watched them go, watched Anita shepherd her daughters and their friends and their parents down into the earth. Just before she descended the stairs, she looked back at him one more time. "Don't die!" she called out. "Wasn't planning on it," he called back. She disappeared underground. He heard the cellar door close, heard the bolt slide home. Then he was alone. Ronald walked to the front of the property, rolling his shoulders, feeling the familiar, pre-violence calm settle over him like a second skin. This was the mode he knew. This was the person he'd been before he met 2 little girls who wanted piggyback rides. The SUVs pulled into the yard, killing their engines in synchronized precision. Doors opened. Men emerged. 6 of them that Ronald could see, probably more in the vehicles. They wore casual clothes but moved with military precision. Trained. Professional. The uncle's best. The lead man was someone Ronald recognized. Vincent Caruso, the uncle's enforcer. Mid-40s, built like a brick wall, with dead eyes that had seen too much violence to be bothered by more. "Ronnie," Vincent called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "Been looking for you, boss, or should I say former boss?" Ronald said nothing. He stood on the porch, hands loose at his sides, the knife hidden but ready. "Uncle Lou wants to talk." Vincent continued, walking forward slowly. His men fanned out, flanking positions. "Says you took something that belongs to him when you left." "The only thing I took was my life," Ronald replied. "He's welcome to his throne." "See, that's where you're wrong." Vincent smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You took respect. You took fear. You took the reputation he spent 30 years building, and you walked away like it was nothing." He looked around at the farmhouse, the birthday decorations, the cake on the table. "What is this place? You playing house now?" "This has nothing to do with you. Leave and I won't make this worse than it has to be." Vincent laughed. "You're one man with no backup. We're 6 with heavy ordnance in the trucks. The math doesn't work in your favor." "Math never was your strong suit, Vince." The enforcer's smile faded. "Last chance, Ronnie. Come quiet. Talk to the uncle. Maybe we can work something out." Ronald's hand moved to his boot. The knife came out smooth and fast, catching the afternoon sun. "Or maybe," he said quietly, "you can tell the uncle that I'm done running." Vincent sighed and pulled his gun. "Your funeral, kid." The other 5 men drew weapons, spreading into a semicircle. Professional, coordinated, exactly what Ronald expected. But they didn't know the property. They didn't know the terrain. And they didn't know that Ronald Vesperi, at 21 years old, had survived 7 years in the underworld by being smarter, faster, and more ruthless than anyone expected. The birthday party was over, the war had come to the farmhouse, and Ronald was done pretending to be anything other than what he was. Ronald moved first. He'd learned early that in a gunfight, hesitation was death. The men expected negotiation, posturing, maybe a standoff. They didn't expect him to dive off the porch before Vincent finished talking, rolling behind the water trough, as the first shots cracked through the air where he'd been standing. Bullets punched through the decorations. Streamers fell like confetti. A balloon popped with a sound that made Ronald's teeth clench. They were shooting at a birthday party. That thought crystallized something cold and final in his chest. He came up from behind the trough and threw the knife in one fluid motion. It wasn't a killing throw, just a distraction, but it caught one of the flanking men in the shoulder and sent him stumbling back with a shout. Ronald was already moving, sprinting low toward the barn as bullets chewed up the dirt around his feet. He hit the barn door and rolled inside into darkness that smelled like hay and old wood. His eyes adjusted quickly. Farm equipment everywhere. A rusted plow, shovels hanging on the wall, a pitchfork, an axe, arsenal. Footsteps outside, 2 men moving to flank the barn entrance. Ronald grabbed the pitchfork and pressed himself against the wall beside the door. The first man came through fast and tactical, sweeping with his weapon. Ronald drove the pitchfork into his thigh, not deep, just enough to drop him screaming. The gun clattered away. Ronald kicked it into the shadows and was gone before the second man made it through the door. Out the back of the barn, around the side. The property was chaos now, men shouting, trying to coordinate. Vincent barking orders. They thought they were hunting one scared kid. They didn't realize they'd walked into a trap built by someone who'd been outmaneuvered and cornered before and learned to turn environment into advantage. Ronald circled wide, using the workshop for cover. Inside were Anita's tools. He grabbed a heavy wrench and kept moving. A man rounded the corner, and Ronald was on him before he could raise his weapon, the wrench connecting with his wrist. Bones cracked. The gun fell. Ronald swept his legs and left him gasping in the dirt. 3 down. 3 to go, plus Vincent. Shots from the house. They were checking inside, looking for hostages probably. Ronald's blood went ice cold. If they found the cellar, if they found the twins... He needed to end this now. Ronald ran for the tractor Anita had been working on, still parked near the workshop. The keys were in it, like everything else out here that assumed the world was fundamentally good. He turned the engine over, and it roared to life, black smoke belching from the exhaust. 2 men came running from the house. Ronald put the tractor in gear and drove straight at them. They scattered, firing wildly. Bullets sparked off the metal frame. Ronald jumped off while it was still moving, letting the tractor crash into the porch with a sound like the world ending. The distraction bought him seconds. He used them to sprint to the nearest SUV, yanking open the door. Keys still in the ignition. Amateurs. He grabbed the pistol from the center console and finally had a weapon that evened the odds. A man emerged from behind the workshop. Ronald shot him twice in the leg, dropping him. Non-lethal. He didn't want to kill anyone if he could help it. These were soldiers following orders. The only one who deserved worse was Vincent. Speaking of which, the enforcer appeared on the porch of the house, using the doorframe for cover. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Ronnie." "That's the idea," Ronald called back from behind the SUV. "We found your little hideaway, the root cellar. We know they're down there." Ronald's finger tightened on the trigger, but his mind stayed cold. And Vincent was bluffing. Had to be. If they'd actually found it, he would have dragged someone up by now, used them as leverage. He was fishing, trying to make Ronald emotional, make him stupid. Not happening. Ronald checked his ammunition. 1 magazine, maybe 12 rounds. He'd hit 4 men. 2 were already down from the knife and pitchfork. That left 2 active shooters plus Vincent. Movement to his left. Ronald spun and fired twice. A man went down, clutching his shoulder, his weapon skittering away across the dirt. 1 left. The last shooter tried to be smart, coming around the far side of the barn for a flanking position, but Ronald had been watching his shadow on the ground. When he appeared, Ronald was ready. 2 shots, both legs. The man collapsed, screaming. Now it was just Vincent. The enforcer had gone quiet, which meant he was repositioning or calling for backup. Ronald needed to move before either happened. He grabbed a handful of rounds from the downed man's pockets and reloaded, then started working his way toward the house. The tractor was still smoking where it had crashed into the porch, creating cover and chaos. Ronald used it, moving low and fast. He came up on Vincent's blind side, the gun trained on the doorway. "It's over, Vince," Ronald called out. "Your men are down. You're alone. Walk away and tell the uncle this territory is closed." "You know I can't do that. Then you'll end up like them." Vincent stepped out from the doorway, his gun lowered but not dropped. His face was calm, professional. "You've gotten better since the last time we worked together. Faster. You taught me well. I taught you to survive, and not to walk away." Vincent shook his head. "The uncle's not going to stop, Ronnie. You know that. You can win today, maybe tomorrow, but eventually he'll send enough people that you won't walk away from it." "Then give me a reason for him to stop." Ronald moved before Vincent could process the words. He closed the distance in 3 strides, batting the gun aside and driving his shoulder into the older man's chest. They went down together, grappling in the dirt. Vincent was stronger, more experienced, but Ronald was younger and had 7 years of desperation fueling every move. The fight lasted maybe 30 seconds. It felt like hours. Ronald got Vincent's arm twisted behind his back, the enforcer's face pressed into the dirt, his own gun now pointed at the base of his skull. "Here's what you're going to tell the uncle," Ronald said, breathing hard, blood from a split lip dripping onto Vincent's jacket. "You're going to tell him I'm out, completely out. I don't want his territory. I don't want his money. I don't want anything to do with the organization. And if he sends anyone after me again, I won't be as gentle as I was today." "He won't accept that. He will when you tell him what I know." Ronald leaned in closer. The offshore accounts, the real estate holdings, the judges he's bought, the evidence I have stored in 3 different cities that goes public if I don't check in every 72 hours. Tell him I bought my freedom with insurance, and if he's smart, he'll take the deal. It was a bluff. Mostly. Ronald had some documentation, but not nearly as much as he was implying. But Vincent didn't know that. "You're making a mistake." Vincent wheezed. Probably, but it's my mistake to make." Ronald pulled the gun back and stood, keeping it trained on the enforcer. "Get your men, get in your vehicles, leave, and don't come back." Vincent pushed himself up slowly, assessing. His men were scattered across the property, wounded but alive. The SUVs were still operational. He could regroup, try again, but the look in his eyes said he was doing the math and not liking the answer. "This isn't over." Vincent said, "Yeah, it is." The enforcer limped across the yard, calling to his men. They dragged themselves up, bleeding and defeated, loading into the SUVs with the coordination of a routed army. Vincent was the last to get in, staring at Ronald through the window with an expression that promised future consequences. Then they were gone, dust clouds trailing behind them like ghosts, and Ronald stood alone in the destroyed birthday party, surrounded by broken decorations and bullet holes, and waited for his hands to stop shaking. The farm looked different in February. The fields were dormant, waiting for spring, and a thin layer of frost covered everything in the early morning light. The trees along the access road were bare, their branches reaching up like skeletal fingers against a pale sky. Winter had settled over the land with quiet authority, transforming the August heat Ronald remembered into something stark and honest. He drove slowly down the dirt road, taking in every detail. The fence posts he'd never gotten to replace, the barn where he'd fought for his life, the workshop where Anita had fixed his car and told him he was broken too. The Porsche was long gone, sold to a collector in California who'd paid cash and didn't ask questions. In its place, Ronald drove a Ford F-150, 3 years old, sturdy and unremarkable. The kind of truck that could haul lumber or help a neighbor pull a stump or just exist without drawing attention. It had cost less than one of the Porsche's wheels, and Ronald had never felt better about a vehicle purchase in his life. 6 months. 6 months since he'd loaded Vincent and his wounded men into their SUVs and watched them disappear down the road. 6 months since he'd gone to the storm cellar and called down that it was safe, his voice shaking more than he wanted to admit. 6 months since Anita had emerged with her daughters and the neighbor families, all of them wide-eyed and terrified, taking in the destruction of what was supposed to be a birthday party. And he'd left that same night. Had to. The uncle's men might come back with reinforcements, and Ronald couldn't risk staying even 1 more hour. Anita had helped him gather his things while the twins watched from the porch, still wearing their pink birthday dresses, stained with cake frosting and fear. "Will you come back?" Sandra had asked. "I don't know." He'd answered honestly. "You should," Samantha had said. "You're bad at goodbyes." She'd been right about that. He'd driven the Porsche back to the city and spent the next 2 months dismantling everything he'd built. Anthony had been shocked when Ronald told him he was stepping down, but not surprised. His lieutenant had seen the change in him, had heard something different in his voice when he'd finally made contact. The negotiations had taken weeks. The uncle wanted blood. I'd wanted revenge, wanted to make an example. But Ronald had played his cards carefully, offering territory in exchange for peace, giving up power in exchange for freedom. In the end, the uncle had accepted because Ronald had made it clear he was leaving the game entirely, and a former boss in retirement was less threatening than a former boss who might come back for vengeance. Anthony had taken over most of the operations. Ronald had kept only his legitimate investments, the real estate holdings and business ventures that weren't directly tied to the underworld. It was enough to live on, more than enough actually, without being enough to make him a target. Then he'd spent 4 months learning how to be a person instead of a weapon. Therapy, though, he'd never tell anyone that. Reading books that weren't about strategy or warfare, sleeping through the night without a gun within reach, learning to walk into a room without cataloguing exits and threats. It had been the hardest thing he'd ever done. And every day he'd thought about 2 little girls in matching dresses and a woman who'd seen past his violence to the person underneath. Now he was here. The farmhouse came into view, and Ronald's heart did something complicated in his chest. Smoke rose from the chimney. The tractor he'd crashed into the porch had been repaired, and now sat parked by the barn. Someone had fixed the bullet holes in the siding and repainted. Life had continued without him. He pulled up to the house and killed the engine, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been even when facing Vincent's guns. What if they didn't want to see him? What if the twins had nightmares about the violence? What if Anita had decided he was too dangerous, too broken, too much? The front door burst open before he could finish spiraling. "Ronald!" The twins came flying off the porch like they'd been launched from a cannon, identical in their winter coats and boots, their hair longer now but still in matching ponytails. They were bigger than he remembered, taller, their faces having lost some of the roundness of early childhood. But their smiles were exactly the same. They hit him simultaneously as he climbed out of the truck, wrapping around his legs with the same enthusiasm they'd shown 6 months ago when they'd captured him. Ronald stumbled back against the truck, laughing despite himself, his hands coming down to steady them. "You came back!" Sandra shouted. "You said you didn't know if you would, but you did," Samantha added. We told Mama you would," they said together. Ronald crouched down to their level, and they immediately tackled him into a hug that knocked him off balance. He caught himself with one hand on the ground, the other arm wrapping around both of them. "I promised I'd come back if I could," he said into their hair. "You're late," Sandra informed him. "Our birthday was in August." "It's February now," Samantha explained, as if he didn't know. "I know, I'm sorry. I had things I needed to fix first." "Did you fix them?" Sandra pulled back to look at him seriously. Ronald met her eyes, those 7-year-old eyes that somehow saw right through him. "I'm trying." "Trying is good," she said sagely. "Mama says trying is how you get better at things." Movement on the porch drew his attention. Anita stood in the doorway, or wiping grease from her hands with a rag, her hair pulled back in the same messy ponytail she'd worn the first day he met her. She wore coveralls and a flannel shirt, and she was smiling. Not a big smile, not a dramatic reunion smile, just a quiet, knowing smile that said she'd expected this, had maybe even hoped for it. Ronald stood, the twin still hanging off his arms, and looked at her across the yard. "Nice truck," she called out. "Figured the Porsche was impractical for farm work." He called back. "Planning on doing some farm work?" "If you'll have me." Anita's smile widened just a fraction. "Woodpile's low. Fence still needs those posts replaced, and the tractor could use an oil change." "I don't know how to change tractor oil. Good thing I'm an excellent teacher." The twins were jumping up and down now. I'm still holding his hands. "Ronald's staying! Ronald's staying!" "Am I?" Ronald asked, looking at Anita. She descended the porch steps slowly, studying him the same way she had 6 months ago in her workshop. But this time, what she saw must have been different. The knife was gone from his boot. The gun was locked in a safe back in his apartment in the city, and he had no plans to retrieve it. The tattoos were still there, the scars on his knuckles hadn't faded, but something in his eyes had changed. He wasn't running anymore. "Yeah," Anita said, reaching the bottom of the steps. "You're staying. At least for dinner. We're having pot roast." "Just dinner. We'll see how you do with the fence posts." She paused, her expression softening. "It's good to see you, Ronald." "It's good to be here." The twins dragged him towards the house, chattering about everything he'd missed in 6 months, talking over each other in that way only they could. Anita walked beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and for the first time in 7 years, Ronald felt like he was walking toward something instead of running away. Inside, the house smelled like home cooking and wood smoke and safety. The table was already set for 4, like Anita had known he was coming even before he'd turned onto the access road. Maybe she had. Ronald Vesperi hung up his coat, sat down at the table with his back to the kitchen instead of the wall, and let himself finally rest. He was 21 years old, and he was learning how to live.